I'm Lexi Rivers, 32, the daughter who came up from a blue-collar house, earned an ROTC scholarship, and climbed my way to command. For years, I covered bills, solved crises, and showed up for everyone. But when my own parents joked at a backyard barbecue, no husband, no career, every family has a failed child, I made a decision that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed or humiliated by the very people you carried? Tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive in, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to draw a hard line and stand up for yourself, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and self-respect. What happened next might surprise you. I learned early that reliability was both my gift and my curse. In our house on Maple Street, with its carefully maintained lawn and predictable dinner routines, I was the one who made things work. While my younger brother Tommy played baseball and my sister Sarah practiced piano, I balanced the family checkbook at 14. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I noticed the bills piling up and the worried looks between my parents when they thought we weren't watching. Dad worked construction, steady but not abundant. Mom cleaned offices downtown 3 evenings a week, coming home with stories about empty buildings and the quiet satisfaction of a job done right. They valued order, appearances, the kind of life that looked successful from the outside. Sunday dinners with the good china. Christmas cards with all 4 of us smiling in coordinated outfits. The American dream in modest, achievable increments. I thrived in this environment. Structure gave me purpose. I made honor roll every semester, not for the praise, but for the challenge of maintaining excellence. When other kids complained about chores, I organized our household systems. Color-coded schedules for who took out trash, who fed our aging golden retriever, who helped mom with grocery runs. My parents appreciated this efficiency, though their gratitude came in practical forms rather than words. "She's got a good head on her shoulders," Dad would tell his brother Uncle Mike during weekend visits. Responsible kid. Not warm praise, but acknowledgement. In our family, that counted for something. By 16, I was working weekends at the local hardware store, saving most of my paycheck for family expenses. When the water heater died that December, I covered half the replacement cost without being asked. When Sarah needed money for her senior prom dress, I contributed $200 and watched her beam with gratitude that never quite reached my parents' eyes with the same intensity. Tommy got attention for his batting average. Sarah earned applause for her piano recitals. I received nods of approval for solving problems they hadn't realized existed yet. The pattern felt natural then. I was the foundation, they were the decoration. Both necessary, but one more visible than the other. High school graduation brought my first real recognition. Valedictorian speech, full scholarship to State University, early acceptance to their ROTC program. Dad shook my hand firmly that day, and Mom hugged me longer than usual. For a moment, I thought something had shifted. Then Tommy got drafted by a minor league baseball team 2 weeks later, and suddenly the conversation at family dinners revolved around his signing bonus and travel schedule. I understood. His achievement was easier to explain to neighbors, more exciting to discuss at Dad's work sites. My daughter's studying international relations and military strategy didn't flow as smoothly as my son's playing professional baseball. I adapted to this reality the way I adapted to everything else, by finding satisfaction in competence rather than recognition. College years deepened the pattern. I called home every Sunday, sent care packages during finals weeks, remembered everyone's birthdays with thoughtful gifts chosen months in advance. During breaks, I helped reorganize Dad's workshop, updated Mom's filing system, tutored Tommy through his community college courses when the baseball dreams didn't materialize as planned. My own milestones happened quietly. Dean's List every semester. Leadership positions in ROTC. Summer internships with military logistics companies. These achievements earned polite interest from my parents, but nothing approaching the enthusiasm they showed when Sarah got engaged to her college boyfriend or when Tommy finally found steady work at the electrical company. "You're so focused on your career," Mom would say, not unkindly but with a hint of concern. "Don't forget there's more to life than work." As if dedication were a character flaw rather than a virtue. as if the discipline that kept our family stable was somehow less valuable than the conventional paths my siblings were choosing. I began to notice things I'd previously overlooked. How conversations stopped when I entered rooms, then resumed with forced brightness. How my academic achievements were mentioned briefly at family gatherings, while Sarah's wedding planning dominated entire evenings of discussion. How my parents remembered every detail of Tommy's work schedule, but frequently forgot which base I'd be stationed at after graduation. The imbalance wasn't malicious. It was simply the natural order they understood. Success looked like marriage, grandchildren, proximity to home, careers that could be explained in single sentences. My path, military service, international assignments, leadership responsibilities that came with security clearances, existed outside their framework for comprehension. I compensated by working harder to earn their understanding. Longer phone calls explaining my duties. Detailed letters about training exercises and officer candidate school. Photographs from ceremonies where I received commendations, hoping the visual evidence of achievement might translate into recognition they could grasp. Instead, I received gentle redirections. "That's wonderful, honey. Have you met anyone special on base?" Or, "Your father and I worry you're working too hard. When will you have time for a family of your own?" The questions stung because they revealed the assumptions underneath. That my accomplishments were temporary detours from real life. That leadership and service were acceptable hobbies until I settled into the roles they recognized as permanent and meaningful. I kept showing up anyway. Holiday dinners where I sat quietly while others discussed their conventional milestones. Birthday parties where I arrived with generous gifts and left feeling like a polite stranger. Family crises where my problem-solving skills were essential, but my presence was taken for granted. Love and duty intertwined in ways that made it impossible to separate them. I couldn't abandon people who raised me, even when their version of caring felt like subtle dismissal. I couldn't stop being reliable, even when reliability seemed to make me invisible. The foundation never gets applauded, but without it, everything else crumbles. I told myself this truth every time I drove away from family gatherings, every time I sent money home without acknowledgement, every time I chose loyalty over self-respect. I didn't realize then how much I was storing up. How each small dismissal was accumulating interest. How the careful balance I maintained between love and resentment was becoming increasingly unstable, waiting for the right moment to shift everything into new configurations. That moment was coming, though I couldn't have predicted its precise shape or timing. I only knew that something had to give, because carrying everyone else's weight while having my own strength questioned was becoming an equation that couldn't sustain itself much longer. The warning signs started small, the way family dysfunction usually does. Little comments that lingered longer than they should have. Jokes that carried just enough truth to sting. The kind of casual disrespect that masquerades as affection, but slowly erodes the foundation it claims to rest upon. It began during my late 20s, when my military career was gaining real momentum. I'd completed officer training, earned my first independent command, received commendations for logistics operations that saved both lives and resources. To me, these felt like significant milestones. To my family, they apparently represented an increasingly troubling deviation from normal life. "Still no boyfriend?" became Mom's standard greeting during phone calls. Not, "How's work?" or "Tell me about your recent assignment." Always the relationship status first, as if everything else was killing time until I found a man and got serious about real life. Dad's approach was more indirect, but equally pointed. He'd mention neighbors' daughters who were getting married, having babies, buying houses in familiar neighborhoods. "The Patterson girl just had twins," he'd say during our Sunday conversations. "Seems like yesterday she was your age, running around with no direction." Funny how people settle down eventually. The implication was clear. My direction was actually a lack of direction. My achievements were symptoms of not yet finding my proper place in the world. The more successful I became in military terms, the more they seemed to view it as elaborate procrastination. Family gatherings became increasingly uncomfortable. Cousins would arrive with spouses and children, receiving immediate attention and admiration. I'd show up in uniform on rare visits home, and while initial greetings were warm, conversations quickly shifted to other topics. My promotion to captain warranted brief congratulations before discussion moved to Sarah's new kitchen renovation or Tommy's weekend fishing trip. The message was subtle but consistent. Other people's ordinary experiences mattered more than my extraordinary ones. A cousin's job as a bank teller received more detailed discussion than my role in coordinating international military exercises. A neighbor's engagement party got more enthusiastic planning than my deployment to Germany for NATO operations. I tried adjusting my approach. Maybe I was sharing too much professional detail, making my experiences too abstract for family understanding. I started focusing on personal elements, friendships with fellow officers, interesting places I'd traveled, cultural experiences from different bases. The response was polite but distant, as if I was describing someone else's life rather than my own. Uncle Mike, Dad's older brother, became the family voice of conventional wisdom. During holiday dinners, he'd corner me with unsolicited advice about biological clocks and career limitations. "Military's fine for a while," he'd say, gesturing with his beer bottle for emphasis. "But what happens when you want a real life? Can't raise kids moving around all the time." These conversations happened while my male cousins discussed their jobs without anyone questioning the long-term viability of their choices. Nobody asked Tommy when he planned to settle down from his electrical work. Nobody suggested that Sarah's teaching career was incompatible with family life. The scrutiny was reserved for me, the woman who'd chosen a path outside their understanding. The jokes started around this time too. Nothing malicious, just gentle teasing that carried barbs I was supposed to ignore. "Here comes our career woman," Dad would announce when I walked into family gatherings. "Too important for the rest of us now." Mom developed a habit of introducing me to family friends as our daughter who's still figuring things out. When I corrected her, explaining my rank, my responsibilities, my career progression, she'd wave dismissively. "All that military stuff. What I mean is, she hasn't found herself yet." The phrase stung because it revealed how completely they misunderstood my choices. I had found myself. I'd found purpose, competence, respect from peers and superiors who valued my contributions. What I hadn't found was their approval for the person I'd become, and apparently that made everything else irrelevant. Sarah, now married with her first baby, became the family success story. Every milestone, pregnancy announcements, nursery preparations, first words, first steps, received extensive celebration and documentation. I was genuinely happy for her, but the contrast was impossible to ignore. Her conventional achievements earned parades while my exceptional ones earned polite tolerance. The breaking point approached slowly, like water filling a container I hadn't realized was sealed. Each small dismissal added to the pressure. Each joke at my expense, each redirect away from my accomplishments, each assumption that my life was somehow incomplete or temporary, contributed to a growing tension I couldn't release. I still showed up. Still sent money when family emergencies arose. Still remembered birthdays and anniversaries with thoughtful gifts. Still played the role of reliable daughter, dependable sister, the one who could be counted on to solve problems and ask nothing in return. But something was changing in how I heard their words, how I interpreted their actions. The pattern that once felt natural now felt deliberately diminishing. The family dynamic that once seemed just slightly unfair now appeared systematically designed to keep me in my place, grateful for crumbs of recognition, always striving for approval that moved further away the more successful I became. I didn't know then that all this stored resentment was preparing me for a moment of perfect revelation. That years of being underestimated were building toward an event that would make their misconceptions impossible to maintain. That the very dismissal I'd learned to tolerate would soon become the backdrop for a recognition so undeniable that it would reorganize every relationship in our family. The storm was gathering, and I was walking directly into it with the kind of calm confidence that only comes from knowing you've been preparing for this test your entire life, even when you didn't realize what you were training for. The family barbecue was scheduled for Memorial Day weekend, a tradition Mom had maintained for 15 years. Extended family, neighbors, the usual crowd gathered in our backyard with its freshly painted deck and carefully maintained flower beds. I'd driven 8 hours from my current base, arriving Saturday morning to help with preparations as I always did. The guest list was predictably familiar. Uncle Mike and Aunt Linda with their twin boys, now teenagers who barely looked up from their phones. The Hendersons from next door, who'd watched me grow up and still asked about my plans as if I were 22 instead of 32. Various cousins, some with new spouses to introduce, others with children who ran around the yard while adults watched with indulgent smiles. I wore civilian clothes, as I usually did for family gatherings. Dark jeans, simple blouse, nothing that screamed military precision, but nothing that hid my fitness or bearing either. Old habits die hard. I stood straighter than most people, spoke with the clarity that comes from years of briefing senior officers, moved through social situations with the kind of organized efficiency that civilian gatherings rarely require. The afternoon unfolded predictably. Dad manned the grill with Uncle Mike, discussing local politics and construction projects. Mom orchestrated food distribution with the other women, ensuring everyone had enough potato salad and remembering dietary restrictions with the attention to detail that made her excellent at her job and indispensable at family events. I fell into my usual role, helping where needed, listening to stories I'd heard variations of before, answering polite questions about my work with the abbreviated explanations that didn't make people uncomfortable. When Cousin Jenny described her promotion to assistant manager at the insurance office, I offered genuine congratulations. When the Henderson boy talked about starting college in the fall, I shared appropriate encouragement. The conversation drifted, as it always did, toward personal milestones and relationship status. Sarah, now visibly pregnant with her second child, received extensive attention and advice. Tommy's girlfriend was welcomed warmly, questioned gently about her intentions and timeline. The underlying message was clear. These were the developments that mattered, the achievements worth celebrating. Then Mom, emboldened by wine and the comfortable familiarity of longtime friends, decided to include me in the relationship discussion. "What about you, honey?" she asked with that particular tone mothers use when they're about to say something they think is helpful but isn't. "Still no husband? Still no career?" The question landed wrong on multiple levels. First, the dismissal of everything I'd accomplished professionally, as if 15 years of military service, multiple commendations, and increasing responsibility counted as no career. Second, the assumption that without marriage, my life lacked fundamental meaning or direction. But it was the public nature of the question that made it particularly cutting. She'd chosen this moment, with extended family and neighbors watching, to highlight what she perceived as my failures. Not my achievements, not my service to country, not my confidence or dedication. My deficiencies, as she understood them. I could have responded diplomatically, could have deflected with humor, or changed the subject gracefully. Instead, I felt something shift inside me, like a mechanism clicking into place after years of pressure buildup. "I have a career, Mom. I've had a career for 15 years. Dad, overhearing from the grill, decided to join the conversation with his own version of helpful perspective. "Every family has a failed child," he said with the casual confidence of someone delivering folk wisdom. He gestured toward me with his spatula, not unkindly but with the matter-of-fact tone he used when explaining why certain construction projects wouldn't work. The words hung in the air like smoke from the grill, visible and impossible to ignore. Around us, conversation didn't stop but shifted, people suddenly finding their potato salad fascinating while processing what they'd just heard. Uncle Mike nodded knowingly. Aunt Linda made a soft sound of sympathy. The neighbors exchanged the kind of look that said they'd witnessed something they'd discuss privately later. Failed child. After everything I'd accomplished, everything I'd contributed to this family, everything I'd sacrificed to be the reliable one they could count on, that was his assessment. Not struggling child, not different child, not child finding her own path. Failed. I stood there absorbing the impact, feeling 15 years of dismissed achievements crystallize into perfect clarity about how my family actually saw me. The financial support I'd provided, the problems I'd solved, the crises I'd managed, none of it had earned me respect or understanding. I was still the deviation from normal, the family member who'd chosen incorrectly and needed to be tolerated rather than celebrated. Then, as if the universe had been waiting for exactly this moment to reveal its sense of dramatic timing, we heard the helicopter. It started as a distant sound, the kind that makes people look up casually before returning to their conversations. But this sound grew louder, more focused, clearly approaching our neighborhood rather than passing over it. The steady thrum of military-grade rotors, unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time around aircraft. People stopped talking. Children stopped running. Everyone in the backyard turned their attention skyward as the sound became impossible to ignore. Then we saw it, a large, official-looking helicopter approaching our street, flying with the kind of precision that indicated specific destination rather than routine patrol. "What the hell?" Dad muttered, spatula still in hand. The helicopter circled once, professionally assessing the landing area, then descended toward our front yard with the controlled power of a machine operated by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The rotor wash sent paper plates flying and forced everyone to shield their eyes from debris, but nobody moved away from the spectacle. As the aircraft settled on our lawn, its rotors still turning, official figures emerged. Two men in dark suits, moving with a purposeful efficiency I recognized immediately. Secret Service. Behind them, a uniformed officer I didn't recognize but whose bearing and decorations indicated significant rank. They walked directly toward our backyard, navigating around lawn furniture and flower beds with the kind of focused determination that made it clear this wasn't a social visit. The entire barbecue crowd pressed backward, creating space they hadn't been asked for, instinctively understanding they were witnessing something outside their normal experience. The senior officer approached me directly, ignoring the crowd of confused family members and neighbors. His bearing was impeccable, his uniform crisp despite the helicopter journey, his expression serious but respectful. "Madam Commander," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now-silent backyard. "The White House needs you immediately." The words hit the gathering like a physical force. "Madam Commander. White House. Immediately." Each syllable reconfigured the afternoon, transforming a casual family barbecue into something none of them had ever experienced before. I looked at my parents. Dad still held his spatula, but his face had gone pale. Mom stared at me as if seeing a stranger, her earlier confidence evaporating as the implications of what she was witnessing began to register. Uncle Mike's mouth was open. The neighbors were whispering urgently to each other. Sarah looked from me to the officers to the helicopter, trying to process how her ordinary sister had suddenly become someone important enough to warrant this kind of attention. The moment stretched, perfect and terrible, as years of dismissal collided with undeniable recognition. Every joke about my career, every suggestion that I needed to find real purpose, every implication that I was the family failure, all of it suddenly revealed as profound misunderstanding of who I actually was and what I actually did. I straightened, feeling the familiar comfort of military bearing take over. "I'll need 5 minutes to change into uniform." The officer nodded. "Of course, Commander. We'll wait." As I walked toward the house, I could hear the beginning of hushed, urgent conversations behind me. People trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed, reassessing everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman who'd been helping serve potato salad 20 minutes earlier. Dad was pinching himself, literally, standing there with disbelief written across his face. Mom looked like she'd seen a ghost, specifically, the ghost of her own words coming back to haunt her. "Every family has a failed child." The phrase echoed as I climbed the stairs to my old bedroom, where my dress uniform hung in the closet like it always did when I visited. Ready for emergencies, ready for duty, ready for moments exactly like this one. I'd never imagined vindication would arrive by helicopter, but then again, I'd never imagined my parents would publicly call me a failure at a Memorial Day barbecue either. Life has its own timing, and sometimes that timing is absolutely perfect. The silence in the backyard was deafening as I changed clothes. Through my childhood bedroom window, I could see the crowd of family and neighbors standing in awkward clusters, stealing glances at the helicopter on our front lawn, trying to process the radical shift in their understanding of reality. When I walked back outside in full dress uniform, decorations and ribbons catching the late afternoon sunlight, the transformation was complete. Not just in how I looked, but in how everyone else saw me. The reliable family helper had vanished, replaced by someone whose importance they were only beginning to comprehend. The officers escorted me toward the helicopter with professional courtesy. As we passed the barbecue crowd, I caught fragments of whispered conversation. Had no idea. All this time. Why didn't she ever say? But the most telling reaction came from my parents. Dad stood frozen, spatula hanging loose in his hand, staring after me with an expression I'd never seen before. Mom had tears in her eyes, not of pride, but of shock, maybe even fear at how completely she'd misunderstood her own daughter. I paused at the edge of the yard, turned back to address the gathering with the same calm authority I used in briefing rooms and command centers. "I'll call when I can," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the sudden quiet. "Enjoy the rest of the barbecue." Then I walked away from 15 years of patient explanation, gentle correction, and quiet disappointment. I walked away from being the family member who was tolerated rather than celebrated, dismissed rather than respected, labeled as failed rather than recognized as accomplished. The helicopter lifted off with the same precision it had landed, carrying me toward whatever crisis required immediate attention from someone whose expertise was apparently more valued by the White House than by her own family. Below us, the barbecue crowd stood watching until we disappeared from view, probably still trying to understand how their assumptions about me had been so completely wrong. I thought about Dad's words as we flew toward Washington. Every family has a failed child. He was right, in a way. But he'd identified the wrong child. The failure wasn't in my choices or my achievements or my unmarried status. The failure was in their inability to recognize the person I'd become, the importance of the work I'd chosen, the significance of the life I'd built. They'd spent years waiting for me to become someone they could understand and celebrate, never realizing I already was someone worth understanding and celebrating. They just hadn't been paying attention. The irony was perfect and painful. They dismissed my career as somehow inadequate, not realizing that the very government they voted for and the country they loved considered my skills valuable enough to interrupt a family barbecue with emergency transportation. They'd suggested I needed to find real purpose, not understanding that my purpose was significant enough to warrant Secret Service escorts and White House summons. As the familiar landmarks of Washington came into view, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete validation of my choices. Not from family approval or civilian recognition, but from the kind of professional respect that transcends personal relationships and social expectations. The failed child, apparently, was exactly where she was supposed to be. The helicopter touched down on the South Lawn with practiced precision, and I was escorted directly into meetings that would consume the next 18 hours. The crisis, a complex international incident requiring someone with my specific expertise in NATO logistics and European military coordination, was exactly the kind of challenge I'd spent 15 years preparing for. I didn't think about the barbecue until much later that night, when I finally had a quiet moment in a Pentagon briefing room to process what had happened. By then, my phone showed 17 missed calls from family members, each voicemail a variation on shock, confusion, and belated recognition. Dad's voice was shaky. "Honey, we had no idea. Call us when you can." Mom sounded like she'd been crying. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I said those things. Please call home." Sarah's message was longer, rambling. "Why didn't you ever tell us? I mean, really tell us? We thought. I don't know what we thought. But this changes everything." Tommy's was shortest. "Dude. Just dude. Call me." But it was Uncle Mike's message that revealed how thoroughly the afternoon had shattered their understanding. "I owe you an apology." "We all do. I've been thinking about what happened today, and I realize we never really understood what you do, who you are. That's on us, not you." The messages continued for days. Extended family calling to express amazement and apology. Neighbors asking my parents for details they couldn't provide. The entire social network that had witnessed my public dismissal now trying to recalibrate their understanding of the quiet woman they'd consistently underestimated. But the most significant change was in how my parents processed what they'd experienced. Dad called every day for a week, not with his usual distracted small talk, but with genuine questions about my work, my responsibilities, my experiences. As if he was meeting his daughter for the first time at age 32. I keep thinking about what I said, he admitted during one of these calls. About every family having a failed child. I was so wrong. Not just wrong about you, but wrong about what failure even looks like. Mom's approach was more emotional, filled with self-recrimination and attempts to explain their previous behavior. We thought we were being helpful, she said through tears. Encouraging you to want what we thought was normal, what we understood. We didn't realize that what you'd chosen was. She paused, searching for words. Important. Really important. Their newfound awareness was touching, but also overwhelming. After years of gentle dismissal, their sudden intense interest in my professional life felt almost invasive. They wanted details about classified operations I couldn't share, explanations of international situations beyond their background knowledge, stories about experiences that couldn't be reduced to dinner table conversation. More challenging was their attempt to retroactively reframe our family narrative. Suddenly, they remembered achievements they'd previously overlooked, mentioned my accomplishments to friends and neighbors with the kind of pride they'd shown for Sarah's wedding and Tommy's baseball success. They seemed desperate to prove they'd always recognized my value, despite years of evidence to the contrary. I appreciated their efforts, but couldn't immediately trust them. Respect that comes only after public validation feels different from respect based on understanding and genuine appreciation. I'd spent too many years being patient with their limitations to immediately embrace their newfound enthusiasm for my choices. The broader family response was more complicated. Some relatives expressed genuine surprise and admiration, acknowledging they'd never understood the significance of my work. Others seemed almost resentful, as if my revealed importance somehow diminished their own achievements or made them feel foolish for their previous attitudes. Cousin Jenny, whose insurance office promotion had received more family attention than my military commendations, was particularly awkward during subsequent conversations. "You must think we're all so small town," she said during one stilted phone call. "So focused on ordinary things while you were out there doing whatever it is you do." The comment revealed the challenge we all faced. My work remained largely incomprehensible to them, protected by security requirements and professional complexity beyond their experience. They knew it was important now. The helicopter and White House summons had proven that, but they still couldn't really understand what I did or why it mattered. This gap between recognition and comprehension created new problems. They wanted to celebrate me but didn't know how. They wanted to support me but couldn't understand my challenges. They wanted to include me in family discussions, but felt intimidated by the sudden awareness of how different my world was from theirs. I found myself in the strange position of having more respect, but feeling more isolated. Before the barbecue incident, we'd at least shared the comfortable fiction that we understood each other. Now we were all acknowledging the vast differences in our experiences, and that acknowledgement created distance even as it generated newfound appreciation. The most painful realization was how much time we'd lost. Years of surface-level relationships, missed opportunities for real understanding, accumulated resentment on both sides that might have been avoided with better communication and genuine curiosity about each other's lives. I began to see my own role in the family dynamic more clearly. Yes, they dismissed my achievements and underestimated my importance. But I'd also allowed that dismissal, choosing not to push back against their assumptions, not to demand better understanding of my choices. I'd been so focused on being the reliable family member that I'd never insisted on being the respected family member. The helicopter incident had forced recognition, but it was external validation rather than earned understanding. Real respect would require ongoing effort from all of us, their willingness to learn about my world, my willingness to share more of it, everyone's commitment to building relationships based on who we actually were rather than who we'd assumed each other to be. But that work would have to wait. The crisis that had pulled me away from the barbecue extended into months of complex international negotiations, requiring my full attention and expertise. Distance provided perspective on family dynamics, but it also delayed the harder work of rebuilding relationships on more solid foundations. For now, it was enough to know that the casual dismissal was over. The jokes about my lack of career, the implications that I needed to find real purpose, the suggestions that I was the family failure, all of that had been revealed as profound misunderstanding, impossible to maintain after what everyone had witnessed. Justice had come not in arguments or explanations, but in undeniable demonstration. Sometimes that's the only way truth can penetrate years of comfortable assumptions. Sometimes people need to see the helicopter before they can recognize the person who is standing in their backyard all along. 6 months passed before I could return home for an extended visit. The international crisis had resolved successfully, my role in the solution earning recognition that my family read about in newspapers before I could tell them about it myself. The distance had been necessary for the work that required my attention and for processing how fundamentally our family dynamics had shifted. The changes were immediately apparent when I walked into my parents' house that December. Photos that had never been displayed now occupied prominent spots in the living room, me in uniform receiving commendations, shaking hands with officials whose names they'd Googled to understand their significance. My military service, once treated as an extended phase I'd eventually outgrow, was now presented as the family's source of pride. It felt strange seeing my professional life curated for their social context, my achievements reframed as evidence of their successful parenting. The same accomplishments they'd politely tolerated for years were now conversation starters with neighbors, proof of their daughter's importance that reflected well on their judgment and values. Dad had done research. He'd read articles about NATO logistics, studied explanations of military command structures, even watched documentaries about women in leadership roles. His questions, when they came, were more informed but also more tentative, as if he was afraid of revealing how little he'd understood before. "I never realized the scope of what you do," he said during one of our evening conversations. "The responsibility, the people depending on your decisions." When I think about some of the things I said, he trailed off, shaking his head. Mom had taken a different approach, focusing on the emotional cost of their previous attitudes. She'd apparently spent months reviewing family interactions, recognizing patterns of dismissal she'd been blind to before. Her apologies were thorough and painful, detailed catalogs of moments when she'd failed to appreciate my choices or achievements. "I keep remembering things I said, ways I acted," she confided. "How many times I suggested you were missing out on real life while you were actually living a bigger life than any of us understood." Their remorse was genuine, but also overwhelming. I'd wanted recognition and respect, not guilt and self-flagellation. Their new awareness of my importance came with intense regret for their previous blindness, creating emotional complexity that was almost harder to navigate than the original dismissal. Sarah and Tommy had their own adjustments to make. Sarah, now a mother of 2, seemed to struggle with recontextualizing our relationship. She'd grown comfortable being the family success story, the daughter whose choices were celebrated and supported. My revealed significance didn't diminish her accomplishments, but it changed her position in the family narrative. "I always thought you were the strong one, the independent one who didn't need the same kind of support the rest of us did," she said during a sisterly conversation. "Now I realize we just never offered you the right kind of support." Tommy was more straightforward in his response, treating the whole situation as a revelation that explained things he'd never fully understood. "You were always different," he said. "More serious, more focused. We thought that meant you were missing out on fun. Turns out you were preparing for stuff we couldn't even imagine." The extended family had divided into 2 camps, those who embraced the new understanding of my importance and those who seemed almost resentful of having their assumptions overturned so dramatically. Uncle Mike fell into the first category, becoming an unexpected advocate for taking my perspectives more seriously in family discussions. Others struggled more with the shift. Cousin Jenny, whose insurance office achievements now seemed modest in comparison to my White House summons, had grown distant during family gatherings. Not hostile, but clearly uncomfortable with the recalibration of our relative status within the family hierarchy. The neighbors had their own reactions. The Hendersons, who'd watched me grow up, seemed almost proprietary about my success, telling anyone who'd listen about the day the helicopter landed in our yard. Others were more reserved, perhaps feeling foolish about their previous casual dismissal of the quiet girl next door who'd apparently been more important than any of them realized. But the most significant change was in how family gatherings functioned. Previously, my presence had been taken for granted, helpful, reliable, but not particularly noteworthy. Now there was a subtle deference that felt almost as uncomfortable as the previous dismissal had been. People asked my opinion about international events as if my military background made me an expert on all global politics. They referenced my career with the kind of careful respect usually reserved for clergy or medical professionals. They seemed afraid of saying something that might reveal their continuing lack of understanding about my work or its importance. I found myself missing the casual familiarity of our old interactions, even though those interactions had been built on fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I'd accomplished. At least then we'd been comfortable with each other, even if that comfort had come at the cost of real recognition or respect. The challenge now was building new patterns of interaction based on accurate understanding rather than comfortable assumptions. It required patience from all of us, their willingness to learn about aspects of my life they'd never been curious about before, my willingness to share experiences I'd learned to keep private, everyone's commitment to creating space for who we actually were rather than who we'd expected each other to be. Some conversations went better than others. Dad and I found common ground discussing leadership challenges, drawing parallels between managing construction crews and commanding military units. Mom began asking thoughtful questions about the personal costs of my career choices, seeking to understand sacrifices she'd never recognized before. But there were also moments of profound awkwardness, when the gap between their new awareness and their actual understanding became impossible to ignore. They knew my work was important now, but they still couldn't really comprehend what I did or why it mattered. They wanted to be proud of me, but their pride was based on external validation rather than genuine appreciation for my skills and dedication. I realized that real reconciliation would take years, not months. We were essentially starting over, building relationships based on more accurate perceptions of each other, but without the comfortable assumptions that had previously smoothed over our differences. The work was worth doing, but it was work. Every conversation required more honesty and vulnerability than we'd ever practiced before. But slowly, carefully, we began building something more solid than what we'd had, respect earned through understanding rather than assumed through family obligation. The decision came gradually, like dawn breaking over familiar territory. Not a dramatic revelation, but a quiet recognition that the patterns governing our family relationships needed fundamental restructuring. I couldn't continue being the perpetually understanding daughter, absorbing casual disrespect while providing unconditional support. They couldn't continue treating my achievements as curiosities while expecting my reliability in times of crisis. The first boundary I established was financial. For 15 years, I'd supplemented family emergencies without question, car repairs for Tommy, medical bills for my parents, Sarah's various domestic crises that required immediate cash solutions. My military salary had made me the family's unofficial emergency fund, a resource they'd accessed freely while questioning the career that made such assistance possible. After the barbecue incident, when Dad's transmission failed and he automatically called me for help, I said something I'd never said before. I'll need to think about it. The pause on his end of the phone call stretched long enough for both of us to understand that something fundamental had shifted. Not that I wouldn't help. Eventually, I did contribute to the repair costs, but that my assistance was no longer automatic, no longer taken for granted. Of course, he said finally, his voice carrying new awareness that my support was a choice rather than an obligation. Take your time. But it wasn't really about time. It was about establishing that my resources, like my respect, needed to be earned rather than assumed. The pattern of casual extraction, financial, emotional, logistical, had to end before we could build healthier relationships. The second boundary involved my emotional labor. I'd spent years managing family dynamics, smoothing over conflicts, remembering everyone's important dates and preferences, orchestrating gatherings that made everyone else comfortable while requiring nothing from them in return. The emotional management I provided had been invisible precisely because it was effective. When Mom called about planning Sarah's baby shower, expecting me to coordinate details from my base 3 states away, I suggested she work directly with local family members instead. "I'm sure Sarah and her friends can handle the arrangements," I said. "I'll attend when I can, but I can't manage the planning from this distance." The suggestion seemed to surprise her, as if she'd never considered that event coordination wasn't automatically my responsibility. But she adapted, reaching out to relatives who lived closer, discovering that other family members were perfectly capable of handling tasks they'd previously delegated to me. The third boundary was conversational. No more deflecting jokes about my career choices. No more accepting casual dismissal of my accomplishments. No more pretending that suggestions about my life being incomplete or misdirected were harmless family banter. When Uncle Mike made a comment about my still being single at Tommy's birthday party, I responded directly instead of changing the subject. "My relationship status isn't a family problem that needs solving," I said calmly. "I'd appreciate it if we could discuss something else." The directness caught him off guard, but it also ended that particular line of conversation permanently. Other family members took note, adjusting their own approaches to topics they'd previously considered fair game for commentary. These boundaries weren't punitive, they were protective. I wasn't trying to punish my family for years of misunderstanding, but I was establishing conditions under which healthier relationships could develop. The casual disrespect that had characterized our interactions couldn't continue if we were going to build something more substantial. The initial response was predictable resistance disguised as concern. "You seem different," Mom said during one of our phone calls. "More distant. We're worried we've lost you somehow." "You haven't lost me," I replied. "But you can't have the old version of me back. The one who absorbed criticism without responding, who provided support without expecting respect. That person was unsustainable." Sarah was more direct in her pushback. "It feels like you're punishing us for not understanding something you never really explained," she said during a tense conversation about my reduced availability for family crisis management. "I'm not punishing anyone," I said. "I'm just not available in the same ways I used to be. You'll need to develop other resources for the support I used to provide automatically." The adjustment period was difficult for everyone. Family members who'd grown comfortable with my reliability as a constant had to adapt to my reliability as something that needed to be earned and maintained. They had to start considering my perspectives, my limitations, my needs in ways they'd never been required to before. Some relationships deepened during this process. Dad, perhaps motivated by guilt over his failed child comment, made genuine efforts to understand my work and respect my choices. Our conversations became more substantive, more reciprocal, based on mutual curiosity rather than his assumptions and my accommodation. Others remained strained. Cousin Jenny seemed to interpret my boundaries as rejection of the family itself, rather than rejection of unhealthy patterns within family relationships. She became formal in her interactions with me, polite but distant, as if my insistence on respect had somehow violated an unspoken agreement about our relative positions. The most significant test came when Mom had what initially appeared to be a heart attack. The call came while I was in the middle of a critical training exercise, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't immediately arrange emergency leave to rush home. Instead, I gathered information, determined that Sarah and Tommy were handling the immediate crisis, and called the hospital directly to assess Mom's actual condition. When the situation proved less serious than initially feared, exhaustion and anxiety rather than cardiac emergency, my measured response became a family controversy. Sarah, in particular, was outraged that I hadn't dropped everything to be there. "She could have died," Sarah said during a heated phone call. "And you stayed for some training exercise?" "She didn't die," I replied calmly. "She wasn't in immediate danger after the first few hours. Tommy was with her, you were handling medical decisions, and my presence wouldn't have changed her treatment or outcome. Coming home would have been about making you feel better, not about Mom's actual needs." The conversation revealed how much my family had relied on my crisis response as emotional comfort rather than practical necessity. My presence during emergencies had often been more about their anxiety than about solving actual problems. Learning to distinguish between genuine need for my assistance and reflexive expectation of my availability became crucial for all of us. Over time, the boundaries I'd established began producing the relationships I'd hoped for. Family members started asking about my work with genuine curiosity rather than polite tolerance. They began considering my perspectives on family decisions instead of assuming my compliance. They started offering support for my challenges instead of expecting me to be everyone else's source of strength. But these improvements came at a cost. Some family members never adjusted to the new dynamic, preferring to maintain distance rather than engage with me as an equal rather than a resource. A few relationships remained permanently altered, cordial but no longer close, casualties of patterns that couldn't survive more honest interaction. I missed some aspects of our old dynamic, the easy familiarity, the uncomplicated assumption that I'd always be available and understanding. But I didn't miss the casual disrespect, the dismissal of my achievements, the expectation that I'd provide everything while asking for nothing. The boundaries weren't walls, they were frameworks for healthier interaction. Within those frameworks, some relationships flourished while others withered. The difference was telling. The people who could respect my limits turned out to be the people worth having closer relationships with. Setting these boundaries required accepting that I couldn't control how other people responded to them. Some family members rose to meet the new expectations, while others chose distance over adjustment. Both responses provided valuable information about the relationship's potential for growth and mutual respect. By the end of that first year after the barbecue incident, our family had reorganized itself around more honest acknowledgments of who we actually were rather than who we'd assumed each other to be. The process was ongoing, requiring constant attention and adjustment, but it was producing something more sustainable than what we'd had before. I was no longer the family member who could be counted on to absorb unlimited stress while asking for nothing in return. I was the family member whose support came with conditions, whose respect needed to be earned, whose presence was a gift rather than an obligation. The shift was uncomfortable for everyone, but discomfort had turned out to be the price of authenticity. We were learning to relate to each other as adults with agency and boundaries rather than as people trapped in childhood roles that no longer served anyone's actual needs. The real work was just beginning. 2 years after the helicopter landed in our backyard, I found myself back home for Christmas, observing changes that had crystallized slowly but definitively. The woman who'd absorbed casual dismissal while providing unconditional support no longer existed. In her place was someone who participated in family life selectively, strategically, with clear awareness of her own worth and limitations. The transformation hadn't been easy for anyone. Family members who'd grown comfortable with my automatic availability had to develop other resources for crisis management. Relationships that had functioned primarily through my emotional labor either evolved or diminished. The comfortable predictability of our old patterns gave way to something more honest, but requiring more effort from everyone. Dad had made the most significant adjustment. The man who'd once casually labeled me the family failure now sought my opinion on decisions large and small. When he considered changing companies, he asked about the strategic implications. When Mom worried about their retirement planning, he suggested consulting me about long-term financial thinking. The respect felt genuine because it was based on demonstrated competence rather than obligatory family loyalty. I keep thinking about that day he told me during a quiet moment while we worked together organizing his garage. What I said, how wrong I was about everything. Not just about you, but about what success looks like, what matters in life. His acknowledgement meant more than apologies because it represented genuine learning rather than simple regret. He'd spent months reconsidering assumptions about achievement, recognizing that his narrow definitions had blinded him to forms of excellence outside his experience. Mom's evolution was more complex. She'd always been the family's emotional center, managing relationships and maintaining connections through careful attention to everyone's needs and feelings. My withdrawal from that system had forced her to reconsider how family cohesion could be maintained without relying on one person's limitless emotional availability. "I realize now how much work you were doing that the rest of us took for granted," she said during one of our restructured phone calls. "Not just the practical stuff, but keeping everyone connected, making sure people felt included and valued. When you stepped back, we had to learn how to do that for ourselves." The learning process had been bumpy. Without my automatic mediation, family conflicts had required more direct resolution. Siblings had to communicate with each other instead of using me as an intermediary. Extended family gatherings required more intentional planning when the reliable organizer was no longer automatically available. But the result was a more distributed system of family maintenance, with multiple people taking responsibility for connections and celebrations instead of defaulting to my management. Sarah had become more active in coordinating gatherings. Tommy had started remembering birthdays and anniversaries independently. Even Uncle Mike had begun making direct contact with family members instead of relying on information filtered through others. Sarah's adjustment had been particularly revealing. As the family member whose conventional achievements had always received enthusiastic support, she'd struggled with the recognition that my unconventional path had ultimately proven more significant than anyone had understood. The sister who'd grown accustomed to being celebrated for marriage and motherhood had to reconcile that narrative with having a sister whose work warranted White House attention. "I think I resented you for a while," she admitted during a conversation that wouldn't have been possible under our old dynamic. "Not for what you accomplished, but for how it made me question whether my choices were important enough. Then I realized that wasn't really about you. It was about my own insecurities about the value of what I'd chosen." Her honesty opened space for a more authentic relationship between us. Instead of competing for parental approval or family resources, we could appreciate each other's different contributions to the world. Her work as a teacher and mother mattered differently than my military service, but both had value that didn't need to be ranked or compared. Tommy had perhaps the simplest response to our family's reorganization. "Things are better now," he said with characteristic directness. "More honest. We actually know each other instead of just thinking we do." His observation captured something essential about what had changed. The old family system had functioned through comfortable assumptions and familiar roles that required minimal examination. The new system demanded ongoing attention to who we actually were and what we actually needed from each other. Extended family reactions varied more widely. Uncle Mike had become an unexpected ally, often redirecting conversations away from personal criticism and toward more substantive topics. "Let's talk about something that matters," became his standard response when discussions veered toward judgmental gossip about family members' life choices. Other relatives remained uncomfortable with the new dynamic. Cousin Jenny continued to interact with me formally, maintaining polite distance rather than engaging with the reality of our changed relationship. Some gatherings felt strained as people navigated unfamiliar social territory without the old patterns to guide them. The neighbors had their own recalibrations to make. The Hendersons, who'd watched me grow up and witness the helicopter incident, seemed almost proprietary about my success. They'd become unofficial family historians, telling anyone who'd listen about the day they realized their quiet neighbor was more important than any of them had imagined. But their newfound respect, while gratifying, also felt somewhat hollow because it was based on external validation rather than genuine understanding of my character or choices. They celebrated my importance now, but they hadn't valued my dedication or competence before it was publicly demonstrated. The most profound change was in how I experienced family gatherings. Previously, I'd attended with a mixture of duty and hope, duty to maintain family connections, hope for recognition that rarely materialized. Now I attended with clear boundaries and realistic expectations, able to enjoy genuine connections while remaining detached from dysfunctional patterns. Christmas dinner that year illustrated the difference perfectly. Instead of automatically managing logistics and smoothing over tensions, I participated as a guest in my own family. When conflicts arose between other family members, I offered perspective if asked, but didn't assume responsibility for resolution. When conversations turned to topics I found uninteresting, I excused myself rather than politely enduring them. The result was a more relaxed, authentic version of myself at family events. People who wanted genuine interaction with me could have it. Those who preferred the old dynamic of taking my presence for granted simply had less access to my attention and energy. "You seem happier," Mom observed during Christmas cleanup. "More yourself, if that makes sense." It did make sense. For years, I'd performed the role of the endlessly accommodating family member, suppressing my own needs and perspectives to maintain harmony. The performance had been exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. The authentic version of myself, boundaries intact, respect required, was indeed happier and more sustainable. But the transformation had required accepting some permanent losses. Relationships that couldn't adapt to mutual respect had withered. The easy familiarity of unexamined assumptions was gone forever. Some family members remained uncomfortable with the person I'd revealed myself to be when I stopped performing the role they'd preferred. I'd learned that you can't force people to see you accurately, but you can refuse to enable their inaccurate perceptions. You can't make family members respect your choices, but you can stop seeking approval from people whose judgment you don't trust. You can't control how others respond to your boundaries, but you can maintain those boundaries regardless of their comfort level. The family that emerged from this process was smaller but stronger. The relationships that survived the transition to honesty and mutual respect proved more satisfying than what we'd had before. The ones that didn't survive had probably been unsustainable anyway, held together by my willingness to absorb disrespect rather than by genuine affection or understanding. Standing in my childhood home that Christmas, helping with dishes while listening to conversations that included my perspectives instead of dismissing them, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete comfort in my own family. Not the resigned tolerance I'd mistaken for comfort, but actual ease with people who saw me accurately and chose to value what they saw. The failed child had finally found her place, not by changing to meet their expectations, but by refusing to accept their limitations as permanent truth about her worth. 5 years have passed since the day my father called me the family failure at a backyard barbecue. 5 years since Air Force One landed on our front lawn and reconfigured every assumption my family had made about my life and choices. The intervening time has settled into new rhythms, new understandings, new ways of being connected that don't require anyone to diminish themselves for the comfort of others. I'm writing this from my office in the Pentagon, where the walls display commendations and photographs from a career that has continued to exceed even my own expectations. The work that once mystified my family has taken me to 6 continents, through crises that tested everything I'd learned about leadership and strategy. Into rooms where decisions affecting millions of people required the kind of expertise I'd spent decades developing. Last month, I was promoted to Brigadier General, becoming one of the youngest women to achieve that rank in my field. The ceremony was attended by colleagues, mentors, and senior officials who understand the significance of the achievement. My parents were there too, sitting in the front row with expressions of pride that looked different from the belated recognition they'd offered after the helicopter incident. This pride was earned through understanding rather than external validation. Over the years, they'd made genuine efforts to comprehend not just the importance of my work, but the personal qualities that had made such work possible. The discipline they'd once dismissed as excessive they now recognized as essential. The focus they'd interpreted as missing out on life they now understood as embracing a larger purpose. I used to think success meant staying close to home, following familiar patterns, Dad told me after the promotion ceremony. I was wrong about a lot of things, but mostly I was wrong about thinking small. You taught us that success can look like something we never imagined. The learning hadn't been one-sided. Understanding my family better required recognizing that their initial incomprehension of my choices wasn't malicious, but limited. They'd operated from frameworks that made sense within their experience, unable to value what they couldn't understand. Once those frameworks expanded, their capacity for appreciation grew correspondingly. Mom has become my most thoughtful correspondent, sending articles about military affairs with questions that demonstrate genuine curiosity about my perspective. Her letters arrive monthly, filled with family news, but also with reflections on current events, requests for my analysis of international situations, updates on her own learning about subjects that had once seemed impossibly foreign. "I'm proud of how much I've learned," she wrote in a recent letter. "Not just about what you do, but about how much I didn't know I didn't know." It's humbling and exciting at the same time. Sarah and Tommy have found their own ways to bridge the gap between our different worlds. Sarah brings her children to visit my base when schedules allow, giving them exposure to military life and helping them understand their aunt's work. Tommy has become fascinated by logistics and strategy, often calling with questions about how military principles might apply to his electrical contracting business. The nieces and nephews who barely knew me during their early years now have a clearer picture of their aunt's role in the world. They've seen news coverage of international situations where my expertise was sought, read simplified explanations of military operations I've been involved in, met some of my colleagues during family visits. Aunt General, my youngest nephew, calls me, blending family affection with professional respect in a way that captures how our relationships have evolved. The title amuses my colleagues and delights me, representing integration of family identity with professional achievement in ways that once seemed impossible. Extended family dynamics have stabilized into new patterns. Uncle Mike has become an unexpected advocate for supporting family members' unconventional choices, often referencing my experience when other relatives express doubt about children or grandchildren who choose paths outside traditional expectations. "Remember what we learned about my name," he'll say when someone voices concern about a teenager interested in art or a young adult considering military service. Maybe we don't understand it yet, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. Cousin Jenny and I have found a cordial but distant equilibrium. We're polite at family gatherings, ask appropriate questions about each other's lives, but the easy familiarity we once shared never fully recovered from the recognition of how different our paths had become. Some relationships can survive fundamental reframing, others cannot. Both outcomes provide valuable information about the connections that truly matter. The neighbors who witnessed my transformation have their own legacy from that day. The Hendersons still tell the helicopter story to anyone who'll listen, but their narrative has evolved from simple amazement to broader reflection about assumptions and hidden potential. They've become more curious about their other neighbors, more careful about dismissing lives that look different from their own. Professional colleagues who know my background often express surprise at the family dynamics I've described. "How did they not realize?" is a common question, usually accompanied by disbelief that anyone could dismiss military achievements so casually. But their surprise reveals their own assumptions about how recognition and respect function. They operate in environments where professional competence is immediately valued, where achievement translates directly into status and appreciation. They haven't experienced the disconnect between excellence and acknowledgement that characterizes many family systems, where love and understanding don't automatically correlate. I've learned to appreciate both environments, the professional world where my contributions are immediately recognized and the personal world where recognition required more complex negotiation. Both have taught me essential lessons about leadership, communication, and the difference between demanding respect and earning it. The most significant change is internal. I no longer need family approval to validate my choices, but I genuinely enjoy family connection when it comes from mutual understanding rather than duty or habit. The relationships that survived our transition to honesty have become more satisfying than anything we had before. The ones that didn't survive were probably built on foundations too weak to support authentic connection anyway. When young officers seek mentorship about balancing family expectations with military careers, I share lessons learned from my own experience. Don't assume family resistance means your choices are wrong. Don't sacrifice your authentic self to maintain comfortable illusions for others. Don't mistake enabling dysfunction for demonstrating love. But also, don't write off people who need time to understand your path. Don't assume that initial incomprehension indicates permanent limitation. Don't let justified anger prevent you from appreciating genuine growth when it occurs. The story that began with casual dismissal at a family barbecue has evolved into something more complex and ultimately more hopeful. Justice came, as I once predicted, not in arguments, but in undeniable demonstration. But the more lasting satisfaction came in building relationships based on who we actually are rather than who we'd assumed each other to be. My father was right when he said every family has a failed child. he was wrong about which child had failed. The failure wasn't in my choices or achievements, but in our initial inability to recognize and value what those choices and achievements represented. That failure has been corrected, not through dramatic confrontation, but through patient work over time. The helicopter that landed on our front lawn provided the catalyst for change, but real transformation required sustained effort from everyone involved. I'm still the same person who organized household systems as a teenager, who worked multiple jobs to support family expenses, who chose service over comfort and competence over conformity. But now that person exists within relationships that recognize rather than dismiss her value, that celebrate rather than question her choices, that understand rather than minimize her contributions. The failed child found her place not by changing who she was, but by insisting that others see who she had always been. Sometimes that's the only path to genuine family connection, refusing to accept limitations as permanent truths, maintaining boundaries until respect becomes possible, demonstrating through lived example that their assumptions were too small to contain the reality of your life. The barbecue ended years ago, but its lessons continue. Every family gathering now includes the implicit memory of that day when external validation made internal worth undeniable. The phrase, "every family has a failed child," has become family shorthand for the dangers of assumption, the importance of looking more carefully at each other's lives, the possibility that what appears to be failure might actually be success in forms we haven't learned to recognize yet. Justice wasn't a moment of triumph, but a process of recognition. It came quietly, in changed conversations and shifted assumptions, in respect earned through understanding rather than extracted through confrontation. It came in the form of relationships rebuilt on more solid foundations, appreciation based on accurate perception rather than obligatory affection. The helicopter is long gone, but its message remains. Sometimes the most important recognition comes from the outside world before it comes from the people closest to us. Sometimes we have to demonstrate our worth to strangers before family members can see what was always there. Sometimes the failed child is actually the one who succeeded in ways too important for casual understanding. And sometimes, with patience and clear boundaries and refusing to accept dismissal as the price of family connection, even the most entrenched assumptions can change. Even the most comfortable prejudices can give way to genuine appreciation. Even families can learn to see each other as they actually are, rather than as they expected each other to be. The woman who was once called the family failure now leads briefings in the Pentagon, advises senior officials on international strategy, and serves her country with the same dedication she once brought to organizing household systems and solving family crises. The difference is that now her family understands what that dedication is worth, what those skills can accomplish, what that life has always meant. Every family has a failed child. In ours, it turned out to be everyone who failed to recognize success when it was sitting at their dinner table, helping serve the potato salad, waiting patiently for the respect that would eventually come not through arguments or explanations, but through the quiet persistence of excellence that could no longer be denied. That day at the barbecue changed everything, not just how my family saw me, but how I saw myself. Have you ever had someone dismiss your worth, only to be forced to see the truth later? How did you handle it? Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if you've ever had to prove people wrong by simply living your truth, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs the reminder. Your value isn't up for debate.